A billionaire CEO hadn't spoken a single word to a woman outside of business in 12 years. Until the morning his new sous chef accidentally set his kitchen on fire and refused to apologize for it. The staff at Hargrove Holdings had a saying, "If you want to keep your job, stay out of Declan Hargrove's way." Not because he was cruel exactly. He paid well, offered benefits that made competitors weep with envy, and had never once raised his voice in the 22 years since he'd built the company from a single commercial property in downtown Vancouver into one of the most respected real estate development firms in Western Canada. The problem wasn't his temper. The problem was the silence. Declan Hargrove moved through the world like a man who had decided, a very long time ago, that most of it simply wasn't worth engaging with. He gave instructions, received results, and retired each evening to his glass-walled penthouse on the 38th floor overlooking Burrard Inlet. That was the whole of it. "Have you heard?" murmured one of the junior coordinators to another, somewhere between the espresso machine and the elevator bank on a Tuesday morning in November. He hired someone for the executive kitchen. Again? Different this time. She's not from a hotel. I don't know, someone found her at a little place in Gastown. He apparently ate there 3 times in 1 week. The other coordinator winced. Does she know about him? Does anyone, really? What they meant, without saying it plainly, was this. Declan Hargrove did not eat with people. He did not share meals, did not linger over lunch, did not accept dinner invitations, and had not sat at the same table as a woman, socially, voluntarily, without a contract agenda, in 12 years. His executive assistant, a composed man named Stewart, had worked with him for 8 of those years and still ate at his own desk in the anteroom. It wasn't a written rule. It was simply understood, the way cold weather in February was understood. You dressed for it. You didn't ask why. Wren Calloway had not been briefed. She arrived at the Hargrove Holdings Tower at 7:45 on a Wednesday morning, with a canvas bag full of her own knives, a thermos of coffee she'd made herself because she didn't trust office machines, and the particular kind of calm that belongs to people who have survived genuinely difficult things and come out the other side still standing. She was 31, originally from a small town outside Fredericton, and she had spent the last 4 years building a quiet reputation in Vancouver's food scene. Not in the flashy restaurants that got written up in magazines, but in a small, unhurried place on Water Street, where the food was the kind that made people put down their phones. She hadn't particularly wanted this job. Her friend Tobias, who did corporate event catering, had pushed her toward it. "It's one person," he'd said. "Lunch, occasionally dinner if he works late, whatever he wants for breakfast on the days he doesn't go out. The pay is," and then he'd said a number that made Wren set down her coffee. "One person," she'd repeated. "Famously difficult one person." "Right. Well," she'd looked at the number again. "Fine." She found the executive kitchen on the 35th floor, small, immaculate, equipped with appliances that cost more than her first apartment, and she began, as she always did, by opening every cupboard and taking stock. This was her ritual. Know the space before you make anything in it. She was halfway through a mental inventory when the door opened behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She was reading the date on a tin of smoked paprika. "You're the new one." The voice was low, measured, with the particular cadence of someone who chose every word in advance. Wren checked the date. Still good. She set the tin down and turned around. Declan Hargrove was taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of composed face that might have been handsome if it weren't so thoroughly committed to expressing nothing. He was looking at her the way she imagined he looked at spreadsheets, assessing, categorizing. "Wren Calloway," she said, and didn't offer her hand because both of hers were occupied with a jar of preserved lemons she'd found in the back of a cupboard. "How long has this been in here?" Declan blinked. "What? This?" She turned the jar toward him. "These have been back there a while. Did the last person leave them? Or actually, it doesn't matter. I'll replace them. Do you like preserved lemons? Some people find them too sharp." There was a pause. Declan Hargrove had been asked many questions in his life. This was not a category he'd encountered before. "I don't have preferences about preserved lemons," he said, which was, Wren would later think, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her in a job interview that wasn't technically an interview. "Everyone has preferences," she said pleasantly. "They just don't always know what they are yet. That's usually the interesting part." She set the jar on the counter and picked up her canvas bag. "I'll need an hour to get a proper sense of what you actually keep in here, versus what looks like it was ordered by someone who read an article. Then I'll make you something for lunch and you can tell me if I'm in the right direction." Declan was quiet for a moment. "Stuart handles the ordering, I know. Stuart and I already spoke. He's very efficient." She said it without irony, which somehow made it land heavier than sarcasm would have. "I've got questions for you, though. When you come in, I'll have a list, 4 questions, short ones." She began unpacking her knives with the focused care of someone who'd carried them a long way. "You can answer them in whatever order you want." He stood there for another few seconds in a way that suggested he wasn't used to being told what he'd be doing. Then, without another word, he left. Stuart appeared in the doorway approximately 40 seconds later, looking slightly awed. "He didn't say anything. He left," Wren pointed out. Yes, that's what I said." She made him a roasted squash bisque for lunch with brown butter and a scattering of toasted pepitas, served with a thick slice of sourdough from a bakery 2 blocks away. She left it on the pass-through counter with a card that had 4 handwritten questions on it. 1. Do you eat when you're not hungry, or only when you are? 2. Is there anything you ate as a child that you still think about? 3. Does texture matter to you as much as flavor or more? 4. What do you actually want from this? She didn't hear anything for 40 minutes. Then Stuart appeared again, this time holding the card. "He answered them," Stuart said, looking as though he'd witnessed something geologically significant. "In writing." Wren took the card. Declan's handwriting was small and precise. 1. Only when I am. 2. Yes. 3. More. 4. I don't know yet. She read the last answer twice. Then she smiled just slightly and got back to work. The first 2 weeks were uneventful in the way that the surface of a lake is uneventful while something is moving underneath it. Wren arrived, cooked, left food with notes, occasionally received written responses. Declan passed through the kitchen sometimes. Mornings, usually when she was prepping, and they exchanged the kind of short functional exchanges that are really just 2 people testing the edges of something without admitting they're doing it. He told her, on day 4, without being asked, that his mother had made butter tarts every Christmas and that he hadn't had one since she died 11 years ago. He said it the way someone might report a weather condition, factually, without apparent feeling. Wren said, "Okay," and didn't make a big thing of it. On day 9, she made butter tarts. Left them on the counter with no note at all. She was already gone by the time he found them. Stuart told her the next morning that Declan had stood in the kitchen for a while before eating one. He didn't elaborate. Wren didn't ask him to. It was on a Friday in the 3rd week that the first real incident occurred. Wren had been experimenting, something she did when a kitchen felt comfortable to her, and had misjudged the heat on a cast-iron skillet she was using to char some cherry tomatoes. The smoke was brief, dramatic, and set off the kitchen's sensor before she could get to the window. The sprinklers did not go off, but the alarm did, and in the 90 seconds before Stuart got it silenced, Declan Hargrove had come through the door at a speed that suggested he'd expected something considerably worse. He stopped in the doorway. Wren was standing at the stove with a damp cloth, and the expression of someone who was annoyed but not particularly alarmed. "It's fine," she said. "There was an alarm. I know, I was here for it." She looked at the skillet, then back at him. "The tomatoes are salvageable, actually. The char is going to be good. Do you want to see?" Declan stared at her. "There was an alarm, Wren." "Yes." She turned the tomatoes with a pair of tongs. "And now there isn't. Are you all right? You look a little." She tilted her head. "Were you worried?" The expression on his face went through several phases in rapid succession. No. I heard the alarm and came to." He stopped. "You should have opened the window first. I know that. I miscalculated." She set the tongs down and turned to face him properly. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to know I'm not being flippant about it." "Fine. I'm a professional. I make mistakes sometimes, I correct them, and I learn. I don't need to apologize for a mistake I've already fixed and learned from." She looked at him evenly. "If that's a problem, this probably isn't going to work." Another long pause. Declan's jaw did something complicated. "That's not a problem," he said, which was not what Wren had expected him to say. "Good," she said. "The tomatoes will be ready in about 8 minutes if you want to stay." He didn't stay, but he hesitated before he left, and that was something. The next morning, Wren arrived to find a new exhaust hood had been installed above the stove. No note, no explanation. She looked at it for a moment, then at Stuart, who was pretending to be very interested in his clipboard. "When did this happen?" she asked. "Last night," Stuart said. "Ah," she set her bag down. "Well, good." She didn't thank him. She thought he'd probably find it annoying to be thanked for something he'd done without admitting to. But when she made coffee that morning, she made 2 cups and left one on the pass-through. She heard him pick it up. She didn't turn around. It was Max. Not a Max from the office, but her friend Maxine, who worked in the building's HR department on the 18th floor and had been responsible, obliquely, for Wren hearing about the position in the first place, who first put into words what the rest of the building had been noticing. "He smiles," Maxine said, sitting on the kitchen counter while Wren prepped garnishes. Not a real smile, but you know how some people have a smile that's just the corners of their mouth? He does that now. Since you started, he does that at spreadsheets too, probably. He does not. Maxine pointed at her with a celery stick. "I've worked in this building for 3 years. That man has not done the corner thing at a single spreadsheet." Wren said nothing. She was thinking about the coffee cup she'd left that morning and the way she'd been aware, very specifically aware, of him picking it up. She didn't examine that feeling too carefully. She was getting along fine here, and she intended to keep getting along fine. The trouble, as these things tend to go, arrived wearing a good coat. Her name was Carolyn Whitmore, and she was Declan's former fiancée, which Wren learned approximately 30 seconds after meeting her, because Carolyn was the kind of person who let that information into a room before she was done getting through the door. She arrived at the executive floor on a Thursday afternoon under the premise of a board-adjacent meeting, and somehow ended up in the kitchen while Wren was making a late lunch. "Oh," said Carolyn, looking around with the pleasant expression of someone who was not pleased. "You're the chef, sous chef, technically." Wren didn't look up from what she was doing. "Can I help you? I'm just passing through." Carolyn leaned against the doorframe. She was polished, composed, the kind of beautiful that takes significant effort and is designed to communicate status. "I used to practically live on this floor. Declan and I were together for 4 years. Carolyn said it conversationally, as though she was discussing the weather. "He's very private, you know. Not easy to get to know. He seems straightforward to me," Wren said. Carolyn's expression sharpened slightly. "Does he? He knows what he wants? He's honest about what he doesn't know. That's not that complicated." Wren slid a pan into the oven and finally looked up. "Is there something I can get you?" Carolyn studied her with the thorough, slightly uncomfortable attention of someone recalibrating. "No," she said, after a moment. "I don't think so." She left without another word. Declan found Wren still in the kitchen an hour later. He'd clearly run into Carolyn somewhere in the building. He had the slightly compressed expression of someone who'd been in a conversation they hadn't wanted to have. "She came in here," he said. "It wasn't a question." Briefly, Wren handed him a plate without preamble. "Eat. It'll get cold." "Wren," she was perfectly civil. "We talked about how you're complicated." I disagreed. She nodded toward the plate. "Salmon. You said texture matters more than flavor, and I've been thinking about that. So I want to know what you think of the crust." He sat down, which he almost never did in the kitchen, which Wren noticed and said nothing about. "Why did you disagree?" he asked after a moment. She looked at him. "Because I don't think you're that complicated. I think you've been told you are so many times that you started believing it." She turned back to the stove. "The crust, please. Tell me if it's too much." Declan was quiet. Then he said, "It's not too much." After that, he came into the kitchen more often. He didn't always eat. Sometimes he just stood near the window with his coffee, or looked at what she was doing with the focused attention he gave to everything, as though cooking were a form of data he was still learning to read. Wren let him. She didn't narrate, didn't perform, just worked. And slowly, the way warmth spreads through a cold room, the space between them shifted. She didn't notice it happening, exactly. That was the honest truth of it. She noticed the results, that she looked up when she heard his footsteps, that she'd started making slightly more than one portion out of habit, that his written answers to her cards had gotten longer without her asking. But the shift itself was gradual enough that she'd missed it. The way you miss the season changing until one morning you go outside and realize winter is actually over. The moment that made it undeniable happened on a Wednesday evening in January, when she stayed late to test a recipe she was developing, and he was still in the building, because Declan Hargrove was always still in the building. She'd made too much. Obviously. Intentionally, if she was honest, in the way you're only honest with yourself after the fact. She left a plate on the pass-through and was packing up her bag when she heard him come in. "You're still here," he said. "Just leaving." She pulled on her coat. "There's a plate. You don't have to." "Sit down, Wren." She looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen in the particular way he stood when he was working something out. Slightly to the left of wherever he'd entered, weight on one foot, gaze slightly unfocused. "I'm fine too. I know you're fine." He pulled out the stool on the other side of the counter. "Sit down." It was the first time they'd eaten in the same room, facing each other, at the same time, as something that was not a meeting. It was also the best meal she could remember having, in a long time, and she was the one who'd cooked it, so that said something she wasn't quite ready to look at directly. He asked her about Fredericton. She told him about the town, her grandmother's garden, the particular quality of light in the Maritimes in late summer that she'd never quite found anywhere else. He listened the way he read contracts, carefully, with the occasional very precise question. She asked him about the first building he'd ever developed. He talked about it for 10 minutes straight, which she suspected was the longest he'd talked about anything personal since approximately the previous decade. When she finally stood up to leave, she said, "This was nice." He said, "Yes." She gathered her things. At the door, she paused and turned back. He was still sitting there, looking at the space she'd just occupied. "Declan," he looked up. She almost said something. She could feel the shape of it. Instead, she said, "Good night," and left, and stood in the elevator going down, feeling the particular unsettled calm of someone who's just realized the ground has shifted under them, and they're not sure yet whether that's good or frightening. It was both, was the answer. It was both. Declan did not handle the realization well. This was not a surprise, in retrospect. A man who had spent 12 years building careful routines around the precise avoidance of this sort of feeling was not going to receive it gracefully. He received it the way he received anything unexpected, by organizing against it. He became formal. Not cold, not unkind, but formal in the way of someone erecting a structure they hope will hold. He stopped coming into the kitchen during prep hours. His responses to her cards became shorter again, functional, correct. He took calls in the kitchen sometimes rather than sitting, so that Wren would know he was there on business, not for any other reason. Wren noticed. Of course she noticed. She was not the kind of person who missed things. She gave it a week. Then she knocked on his office door. Stuart, who had developed what appeared to be a genuine emotional investment in the situation, held the door open for her without being asked. Declan looked up from his desk. Something moved behind his eyes and was immediately suppressed. "What are you doing?" Wren asked. "Working. What are you doing?" she said again, differently, and waited. He set his pen down. He looked at his desk for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "I think it's better if we keep things professional." Wren sat down across from him, uninvited. "Why?" "Because you work for me." "That's not actually what you mean." He didn't answer. She crossed her arms. "You know what I've noticed? You never avoid things that actually threaten you. You avoided Carolyn until she started avoiding you. You avoided dealing with the Edmonton project until it was the most urgent thing on your desk. You only avoid things when you've already decided they matter, and you don't know what to do about that." A long silence. "You're my employee," he said again with less conviction. "I'm also someone who made you butter tarts and sat in your kitchen on a Wednesday night and listened to you talk about a building in Coquitlam for 12 minutes, and you weren't treating me like your employee then." She held his gaze. "So what is this actually about?" Declan stood up and walked to the window. Below them, Vancouver was doing what Vancouver did in January. Low clouds, the mountains just barely visible, the inlet flat and gray and quietly beautiful. "Carolyn left because I didn't let her in," he said finally. His voice was even. He might have been reading from a document. 4 years and I kept her at exactly the distance I wanted her. When she got tired of it, she left, and I understood why, and I didn't try to stop her because I was—" He paused. "I was relieved that she made the decision, that I didn't have to." Wren said nothing. "Whatever this is," he said, "I don't want to make the same calculation. I don't want to keep you at a distance until it becomes easier to lose you." She stood up and walked to the window to stand beside him. "Not close, just near, parallel." "Then don't," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "I don't know how to do this," he said. I want you to understand that that's not a figure of speech. I genuinely do not. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to be good at it yet. She turned back to the window. I'm just asking you not to run. He was quiet for a long time. Wren watched the water. Then he said, Have dinner with me. Is this a business dinner? No. She looked at him sideways. Then yes. They went to a small place in Yaletown that Wren had been to once and remembered exactly. Unhurried, no pretension, the kind of restaurant that trusts the food to do the work. Declan had apparently looked it up and booked a table in the back, which told her he'd done some research, which she found unexpectedly charming. Over dinner, he told her about his father, a builder who died before Declan was 30, and about the specific grief of admiring someone you could never quite reach. She told him about the years she'd spent working in a restaurant that fell apart mid-service, and what she'd learned from watching things fail with dignity. They talked about Canada in winter, about whether Vancouver counted as a real winter city, about the kind of cold that is actually beautiful versus the kind that's just unpleasant. He paid. She let him. In the car on the way back, the silence was entirely different from the silences she'd navigated in his kitchen. Warmer, inhabited, the kind of silence that means two people are comfortable. When he pulled up outside her building, she sat for a moment before opening the door. That was good, she said. Yes, he agreed. She looked at him. He was watching the dashboard. He did that, she'd noticed. Looked at neutral things when he was trying not to say something. Declan. He looked at her. You don't have to be afraid of this. I know, he said, and then after a pause, I'm working on that. She laughed, a short, genuine sound, and got out of the car. He watched her go inside. She knew without turning around that he did. She'd learned that about him, too. She was in the elevator when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she hadn't saved yet, though she recognized it. Thank you. For dinner. For the butter tarts. For the 4 questions. She read it twice. Then she added the contact. She named him what she'd been calling him in her head for weeks. Declan. Just his name. But it felt like something. It was Maxine who complicated things, which was honestly fair given that Maxine had started them. You know there's a rumor, Maxine said, appearing in the kitchen on a Friday with the look of someone delivering news they're not entirely unhappy about. There's always a rumor, Wren said. This one is about you, specifically, and him. Maxine pointed toward the ceiling, in the general direction of the 38th floor. People are saying, look, I'm not saying it to be, say it, they're saying you've got some angle. That you're using the position to, Maxine made a vague gesture. Get close to him, for reasons. Wren put down her knife. She stood very still for a moment. Who's saying it? The usual infrastructure. I think it started with Carolyn, honestly. She made some comments to someone in acquisitions and it, right. Wren picked her knife back up. Okay. Wren, I'm fine, Maxine, I appreciate you telling me. She was in fact not entirely fine. Not because the rumor stung in the way it might have stung someone, without a reasonably solid sense of who they were, but because it made her aware, sharply and suddenly, of the particular vulnerability of her position. She worked for him. Whatever this was between them, she worked for him, and that meant that any story could be told about her motivations and she had no structural ground to stand on. That evening, she stayed late, not to cook, just to think. She was sitting on the kitchen counter, which she did sometimes when the building was quiet, eating a piece of the bread she'd made that afternoon, when Declan appeared in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. What's wrong? Nothing. Wren. She looked at the bread. I heard there's a rumor. He was quiet. About me. About why I'm here. She kept her voice level. Carolyn, apparently. I heard about it this afternoon, he said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone keeping something contained. I spoke to the people involved. What did you say? That it was false, that the source wasn't credible, and that if I heard it again there would be consequences. He walked into the kitchen and stood near her, not touching, just near. Wren, I'm sorry. That should never have. It's fine. It's not fine. He said it plainly, without heat. And I want you to know that I know it's not fine. Whatever you might be thinking right now about how this looks, or whether being here is worth it, I want you to know that I know exactly why you're here. You're here because you're extraordinary at what you do, and you came in on your first day and held up a jar of preserved lemons and asked me a question no one has ever thought to ask me, and nothing about that is complicated or anything other than what it is. Wren looked at him for a long time. You're better at this than you think, she said, finally. He looked slightly confused. At what? Saying the right thing. She hopped off the counter. I'm going home. But, Declan, she stopped in front of him. Thank you. He nodded. He did the corner-of-the-mouth thing that Maxine had told her about. It was, Wren thought, an extremely good version of a smile. She went home. She slept well. The rumor did not come up again. What came up instead about 2 weeks later was harder. Declan asked her, on a Sunday evening when she'd agreed to come in to prep for a catered event Monday, whether she'd ever thought about opening her own place. It was a straightforward enough question, but when she answered, honestly, she always answered honestly, that she'd had a chance once, years ago, and it had fallen through due to circumstances she hadn't been able to control, he asked a follow-up question. A very precise one. What circumstances? She put down what she was doing. She looked at the counter for a moment. My partner at the time, business partner. We were going to open something together. She paused. He took the funding and left, went to Toronto, used the money for something else. Declan said nothing. It was a long time ago, she said. I've dealt with it. She looked up. I learned not to need anyone's help for things that matter to me. It's not the worst lesson. It's not the best one either, Declan said quietly. She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful attention she'd come to understand was his version of tenderness. Not soft exactly, but precise. He paid attention to things he cared about. I know, she said. Would you let someone help you now? He asked it simply. Not an offer yet. Just a question. She considered it honestly. I think I might be getting there. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. They didn't talk about it again that night, but she noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he'd started asking her questions about the restaurant industry, about location, about licensing, about concepts. Careful, informed questions, the kind that take research to ask. She pretended not to notice what he was doing. He pretended he wasn't doing it. It was the most companionable pretending she'd ever participated in. The falling apart when it came quietly. It was a Monday. Wren arrived to find a message from Stuart asking her to come to Declan's office. Not the kitchen, the office. She went up and found Declan at his desk with the expression of someone who had been sitting in a difficult place for a while. I need to tell you something, he said. She sat down across from him. Okay. The board is reviewing the executive division budget. He said it carefully. Including staffing. The executive kitchen it's classified as a discretionary expense. He met her eyes. I want you to hear this from me directly, and I want you to know that I've made the case for keeping it, for keeping your position. But I can't, he paused. I can't guarantee the outcome. Wren looked at him. She was thinking several things simultaneously, about the job, about the money, about whether that was actually what bothered her most. It wasn't. Is that all? She asked. He looked uncertain. What do you mean? I mean, is the budget review the only thing you wanted to tell me? He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression. No, he said finally. Then say the other thing. A long pause. Declan looked at his desk. Looked at the window. Looked, as he always did, at the neutral surface until he was ready to look at the thing itself. I don't want you to leave, he said. Not the position, you. I don't want you to go. He said it like it cost him something, which she understood. For him, admitting to wanting things was a form of vulnerability he had spent a very long time avoiding. I've been trying to figure out how to say that in a way that doesn't make things more complicated, and I can't find a way, so I'm just saying it. Wren sat with that for a moment. The office was very quiet. Outside the window, Vancouver was doing something beautiful, with low winter light, turning the inlet silver. Declan, she said. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. All right, I didn't take this job because of the salary. I mean, the salary was part of it. I'm not going to lie about that. But I stayed because of the 4 questions, and the butter tart response, and the exhaust hood you installed without saying anything about it. I stayed because of Wednesday evenings and the dinner in Yaletown and the fact that you told me about your father. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not going anywhere because of a budget review. He looked at her with the precise focused quality she'd come to understand as his version of being completely open. But I do need you to stop hedging, she said. Whatever this is, name it. Stop making me wait for you to be ready, because I've been patient, and I think you know that, and I think you know that patience has I'm in love with you. He said it simply, the way he said most things, chosen in advance, committed to completely. That's what I should have said in the parking lot in January. That's what I should have said over dinner. I'm in love with you, Wren, and I've been in love with you since approximately the day you held up a jar of preserved lemons and told me everyone has preferences they just don't know yet." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The answer to your fourth question." He blinked. "What do you actually want from this?" she said. "You wrote, 'I don't know yet.'" She held his gaze. "I think you know now." He stood up from behind his desk and walked around it, and for the first time since they'd met, he reached out first. No hesitation, no calculation, just his hand finding hers. "Yes," he said. "I do." The board voted to maintain the executive kitchen budget by a margin of 4-2, which Stewart mentioned to Wren with barely concealed delight on a Thursday morning in March. Wren thanked him and went back to what she was doing, which was developing a menu for a dinner Declan was hosting for his senior team. The first time he'd asked her to cook for a group rather than just for him, and which she understood, in the particular language they'd built between them, was its own kind of statement. 6 months later, on a Saturday in September, a small restaurant opened on a quiet block in Mount Pleasant, in a space with wood floors and enough natural light and a menu that changed with the season. The sign above the door read Calloway's, which was not the most original name, but it was hers and that mattered. Declan had helped. More than helped. He had understood, finally, that helping someone with something that mattered to them was not the same as taking it from them, and Wren had let him, which was its own kind of growth for both of them. He'd been there the night they got the keys. He'd been there through the construction, mostly standing out of the way and asking precise, useful questions. He was there on opening night, sitting at a small table near the window, not as the investor or the advisor or the very recognizable CEO of Hargrove Holdings, but simply as someone who had reserved a table and wanted to eat. She came out of the kitchen once, briefly, and found him at his table with his coffee, looking at the room with an expression she'd learned to read as the one he reserved for things he was genuinely proud of. She stopped beside his table. "Well," she said. He looked up at her. "The soup," he said. "That's the one." She laughed. "That's all you've got?" "It's the best soup I've ever had. And he paused, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did. "I'm very happy to be here." She put her hand over his, briefly, before going back to the kitchen. It was a small gesture, but small gestures she'd learned. 4 questions on an index card, a butter tart left with no note, an exhaust hood installed overnight and never mentioned, were frequently the most honest ones. They didn't announce themselves. They just told the truth quietly in ways that lasted. That was enough. That was more than enough.